When I bought my dream cabin by the lake, I expected peace and quiet. Instead, I got Karen, a clipboard-wielding HOA tyrant determined to control my every move. What started as a petty dispute over window tint became a battle for freedom, with trail cams, fake maps, and a drone exposing her reign of terror. This is the story of how one man's fight against a nosy neighbor turned a lakefront community upside down. I was halfway up the porch steps carrying my mattress when a county sheriff's SUV slid to a stop at the base of my gravel driveway and a loudspeaker crackled, instructing me to put down the item and step away from the cabin. For a full second, I thought it was some bizarre misunderstanding, maybe a prank, until two deputies emerged with hands near their belts and one shouted, "We got a report of a break-in in progress." That was when Karen stepped out from behind a pine tree. Yes, actually emerged from hiding behind a tree, waving her clipboard like a scepter, hollering that I was illegally occupying association property. I blinked at the absurdity of it all. I had bought this cabin fair and square 2 months ago at a foreclosure auction, had county records in hand, and yet here I was being treated like a fugitive for the crime of moving into my own home. The sheriff, clearly tired of Karen's antics even before I said a word, looked at me, looked at the deed I offered, then looked back at Karen and asked, "Is this going to be one of those days again?" That was my first clue. I wasn't the only one who had dealt with her brand of tyranny, and I hadn't even unpacked my coffee maker yet. The cabin itself was a modest place with weathered cedar siding and a dock that leaned slightly like it had had one too many drinks, but it was mine. After the chaos of a messy divorce and years of corporate burnout, I had sunk everything I had into this little lakefront sanctuary. It wasn't glamorous, but the stillness of the water, the rustle of the trees, and the promise of being left alone were worth every penny. At least that had been the dream. Karen, whose actual name I learned later was Lorraine Tinsdale, was the self-appointed queen of the HOA across the ridge, a ridge that, by all county records, separated her jurisdiction from mine, but lines on a map were mere suggestions to someone like her. She operated on a deeper belief system, that her clipboard gave her divine right. After the sheriff confirmed my deed, and much to Karen's displeasure, advised her to return to her own property, I was allowed to finish unloading. The sheriff gave me a look that said, "Good luck," with the quiet sympathy of a man who'd seen this song and dance before. I hadn't even unpacked my socks before Karen was back, this time snapping pictures of my front porch from the road, muttering to herself about unauthorized renovations in violation of visual conformity standards. I didn't even have curtains up. That night, as I sat on an old rocking chair left by the previous owner, sipping lukewarm coffee and trying to feel peace, I spotted a silhouette with a flashlight near the edge of my dock. When I called out, the figure bolted. I didn't need to squint to know it was her. No one else moved like a scorned cat in orthopedic sandals. The next morning, a plastic sleeve was nailed to my fence post. Inside was a document titled Welcome Packet, Community Guidelines and Compliance Expectations, printed on official-looking HOA letterhead and signed, of course, by President Lorraine Tinsdale. It was filled with things like mandatory window tinting, lawn sculpture restrictions, monthly dues, and a clause requiring pre-approval for any and all dock-related activity. My name wasn't on any of the distribution list. My address wasn't listed in the HOA's plotted boundaries. Still, she had hand-delivered it like a summons from the Pope. The boldness of it was almost impressive in a deranged way. I decided not to respond. Maybe she'd get bored and wander off like an intrusive raccoon. Spoiler alert, she did not. That evening, I received a visit from an elderly neighbor named Joe, a quiet guy who wore his fishing vest even while watering his garden. He shuffled up to my porch with a six-pack and said, "Heard you got the Karen treatment. Welcome to the war zone." He explained that Karen had been on a one-woman mission for years, gradually expanding the influence of her HOA beyond its legal bounds. Most people either caved or moved. One guy, according to Joe, had painted his shed bright orange just to spite her. That shed had mysteriously burned down 2 weeks later. I asked if she was behind it. Joe just sipped his beer and said, "Let's just say the fire department couldn't find the accelerant, but they did find a pair of white orthopedic sandals melted in the mud nearby." I wasn't sure if he was joking. 3 days in, I had settled into a rhythm: coffee at sunrise, renovation work during the day, and dodging binocular glares from the hilltop each afternoon. I was replacing rotted deck boards when a county pickup pulled up and a man with a clipboard, an actual official one, approached. He introduced himself as Keith from the zoning department and said he'd received a complaint about unpermitted construction. I sighed and pointed to the stack of permits I had filed and paid for in advance. Keith flipped through them, nodded, and said, "Yeah, this is all good. Same lady keeps calling in fake violations. We flagged her number last year." I asked if anything could be done about it. He shrugged and said, "Well, you could always file a formal complaint or civil suit. Harassment's a thing." At that moment, an idea lodged itself in the back of my mind. Karen wanted to play legal games. I was happy to get the rule book out. That night, I installed a trail camera pointed toward the road. 2 hours after midnight, it caught Karen ducking under my fence with a measuring tape, jotting things into a notebook by flashlight. She measured the distance from my fire pit to the edge of the water, took a photo of my recycling bin, and then tried and failed to yank up one of my property markers. It was such a ridiculous scene, I watched it on loop twice, laughing harder each time. But underneath the humor was something else, proof. She wasn't just annoying, she was trespassing. She was actively trying to sabotage my life, my home, and my peace. That video changed everything. The next morning, I drove straight to the sheriff's office and filed a report. I handed over a copy of the footage along with a folder of documentation showing I was not and never had been part of Karen's HOA. The deputy on duty raised his eyebrows as he scrolled through the video, let out a low whistle, and muttered, "She's really outdone herself this time." I asked what would happen next. He said a warning would be issued, and if she stepped onto my land again, they'd be happy to escalate. As I left the office, a plan began to form, not just to defend myself, but to go on offense. Karen had crossed the line, and I had the footage, the records, and now a legitimate legal path forward. I spent the rest of the day on calls to a lawyer recommended by Keith, to the county office for boundary maps, and to a local surveyor to confirm what I already knew: this property, my little slice of peace, was firmly outside of any HOA jurisdiction. But now it wasn't just about boundaries or permits. This had become something bigger. She had called law enforcement on me, trespassed at night, filed false complaints, and attempted to enforce regulations that didn't apply. This wasn't a nuisance anymore. It was legal warfare. And as I looked out over the lake that evening, watching the sun melt into the horizon while Karen's binoculars glinted from the distant ridge, I smiled for the first time since I arrived. She had started a fight. She just didn't realize yet that she was going to lose. I woke up to the sound of knocking that was less a polite tap and more a declaration of war. It was 7:03 a.m., and standing at my door was Karen, arms folded, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, and her ever-present clipboard hugged against her chest like a life preserver. She didn't say good morning. She didn't even ask if I had a minute. She simply said, "You're in violation of multiple visual guidelines and material usage restrictions, and your window tint is 2% darker than approved levels." I blinked at her, still half asleep and trying to register how someone could be this committed to nonsense before coffee. I asked her, with as much fake politeness as I could muster, what jurisdiction she believed she had over me. Her response was as baffling as it was infuriating. She said, "Everything facing the lake falls under the aesthetic code of the Southern Lakefront HOA. It's a visual domain issue." I had to sit down, not on a chair, just right there on the porch step, because the stupidity of what she had just said nearly knocked me off balance. Visual domain. She had created an imaginary law based on the fact that she could see my cabin from her house across the cove. I told her flatly that I wasn't in her HOA, never had been, and never would be. Her face pinched like she had tasted a lemon. Then she said, "Well, we'll see what the board has to say about that." I watched her walk away like she was storming off a courtroom drama, except she was wearing fleece capris and dragging a rolling suitcase full of laminated complaints behind her. That night, around 11 o'clock, I saw headlights sweep slowly across my cabin wall. I peeked through the curtain and saw a dark SUV stop at the edge of my drive. The passenger window rolled down, and I caught the unmistakable glint of a camera lens. They were taking photos again, probably trying to document some fictional violation. This time, I didn't shout. I just pressed the record button on the trail cam monitor and let it collect what it needed. When I checked the next morning, I had a crystal clear shot of Karen sitting in the passenger seat while someone else, some poor HOA lackey, snapped pictures with a telephoto lens. The absurdity kept escalating. And I realized I was past the point of ignoring it. This wasn't just harassment. It was organized. It was documented. And it was building towards something bigger. The answer came that afternoon in the form of a thick envelope left on my front steps, weighted down by a small rock. Inside was a cease and desist letter from the Southern Lakefront HOA's legal team, or what they called a legal team. It was printed on generic paper with a Microsoft Word header and riddled with typos. The letter accused me of non-compliance with community bylaws, failure to attend required meetings, ignoring landscape uniformity mandates, and this part made me laugh out loud, refusing to repaint my dock a neutral, community-approved taupe. They had even included photographs of my deck furniture as evidence. The best part, every reference to my address was vague, referring to me only as the resident of the cabin across the cove. They couldn't even legally name me or my property. That, more than anything, told me they knew I wasn't technically under their control. But they were bluffing, hoping I'd cave. They didn't know I was just getting started. I took that fake legal document to a county clerk the next morning. Her name was Cynthia, and when she saw Karen's name on the paperwork, she burst out laughing. She told me Karen had submitted 3 different petitions in the past 2 years to expand the HOA boundaries to encompass areas of visual influence, and each one had been rejected before the ink dried. I asked if I could get an official county zoning map showing my parcel's boundaries. She not only printed it out, but she stamped it right in front of me and added a note at the bottom: "This property is not and has never been under HOA jurisdiction." Then she gave me the name of a zoning attorney in town and told me to give him a call. "You're not the first," she said, shaking her head. "But you might be the one who finally puts an end to it." When I met with the attorney, a guy named Mark Jensen, he leaned back in his creaky office chair and stared at the trail cam footage I'd brought. "She really climbed your fence to measure your dock length?" he asked, pausing the video as Karen crouched with her tape measure and squinted into the moonlight. "This is gold," he said. "No judge is going to look at this and think you're the bad guy." We spent the next hour reviewing the cease and desist letter, the zoning map, and the county clerk's statement. Mark laid out a plan: file a formal cease and desist of our own, cite her for trespassing, and prepare a civil suit if she continued. I asked what we could sue for. He grinned and said, harassment, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, possibly fraud, if she's been misrepresenting HOA boundaries to enforce dues or control. Then he leaned forward and added, "But I want to look into one other thing. If she's been collecting dues from people who aren't legally in the HOA, we might be able to hit her with something even bigger." Back at the cabin that evening, I spotted a paper nailed to a tree by the shoreline. It was another flyer, this time titled Lakefront Code Red, Unauthorized Development Alert. It warned nearby residents of rogue cabin modifications threatening the aesthetic balance of the lake. I was clearly the rogue in question. The flyer even urged residents to document any suspicious behavior, which I assumed included things like trimming bushes or owning furniture that wasn't beige. I snapped a photo and texted it to Mark. His reply came back 2 minutes later: "That's intimidation. Keep collecting." As the week wore on, the temperature dropped, and the trees began to yellow. But Karen's efforts didn't slow down. She sent an HOA representative to my door, an overly formal man named Stewart, who wore a necktie to the woods and said he was there to negotiate compliance. I told him my compliance was with the law, not with Karen's fantasy realm. He gave me a smug smile and said, "Our president is a very persuasive woman." I asked if he meant that as a warning or a confession. He didn't answer. That night, I walked my property with a flashlight and noticed something odd: a small orange flag planted near the edge of my dock. It was the same kind the county uses during surveys. I followed the flags up the shoreline and discovered a line of them, clearly marking what Karen was trying to claim as a new boundary. I photographed each one, pulled every single flag out of the ground, and tossed them in a box. The next day, I dropped that box on Mark's desk. He opened it, stared at the flags, then said, "She's trying to fabricate new lines. This is real fraud. We go after this. We go hard." It was clear now that Karen had no intention of stopping. She wasn't just power hungry, she was addicted to control. She was escalating in ways that bordered on the delusional. And I had the paper trail, footage, and legal backup to expose it all. I knew this wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It was about everyone she had tried to bully. The morning after I delivered that box of fake survey flags to Mark's office, I woke up to the sound of banging metal and frantic barking. At first, I thought it was wildlife, maybe a raccoon in the trash or a deer knocking over a tool rack. But when I stepped outside, I saw my gate hanging open on one hinge, my lock broken and lying on the ground, and Karen's dog, some yappy little mutt with more hair than sense, running loose across my driveway. I followed the noise to the edge of the dock, and there she was, crouched again with her tape measure, this time accompanied by a man holding a clipboard, muttering something about shoreline ordinances. I didn't say anything. I just turned around, walked inside, grabbed my phone, and called the sheriff's department. The dispatcher asked if it was an emergency, and I said, well, there's a woman trespassing on my property again, breaking through a locked gate and bringing animals, and this time she brought a witness. That seemed to do the trick because 10 minutes later, 2 deputies showed up and found Karen still arguing about setback distances while I played the trail cam footage on a loop from my porch swing like I was showing off a vacation reel. When confronted, Karen insisted she had legal authority to inspect the dock because she was in the process of filing a formal annexation request. The deputies exchanged looks, then one said, "Ma'am, annexation doesn't give you the right to break someone's gate." She tried to wave them off with talk of HOA mandates and visual cohesion policies, but they had heard it all before. She was issued a formal warning for trespassing and property damage. And when she stomped off in a huff, dragging her dog and muttering threats, I knew something had shifted. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a pattern of illegal activity. And now law enforcement was starting to take it seriously. Back at Mark's office, we added the new footage and police report to our growing case file. He reviewed everything with the satisfied look of a man watching dominoes align before the push. "She's building this for us," he said, flipping through the timeline we'd laid out. "Every time she steps foot on your land, she strengthens your case. And now with the gate damage, we've got property destruction on top of everything else." He pulled out a legal pad and started sketching out the formal civil complaint. It included harassment, trespassing, property damage, defamation, and attempted fraud via boundary manipulation. I asked if we could also file an injunction. He nodded and said, "Once we serve this, we'll request a temporary restraining order. If she comes within 100 feet of your property after that, she'll be looking at criminal trespass charges." I sat there for a moment, letting it sink in. What started as a bizarre nuisance was now evolving into something real and actionable. We weren't just reacting anymore. We were moving in with force. That night, I returned home to find an envelope taped to my front door. This one was hand-addressed in all caps, "Attention cabin occupant." Inside was a single-page manifesto about the moral and aesthetic obligations of Lakefront citizens, accusing me of environmental neglect, noise pollution, and destabilizing community harmony. It wasn't signed, but I recognized the vocabulary. It had Karen's fingerprints all over it. The irony was that the loudest sound on my property was the occasional creak of the dock or the mournful hoot of an owl at night. I had no music speakers, no power tools after dusk, and my landscaping was more natural than half the artificial turf lots across the water. But that was never the point. The truth was I represented something Karen couldn't control, and that was what really offended her. I was an independent structure in her carefully curated snow globe world. And now that snow globe was cracking. The next day, Mark called with news that escalated everything. He had gone digging through county records and discovered something extraordinary. Karen's original HOA filing from years ago contained multiple boundary maps, each slightly altered with handwritten notations and differing signature pages. In one version, the HOA territory ended exactly where the old county line ran before a zoning update 10 years ago. In another version, the territory extended beyond that line, encompassing my parcel, except that map had never been approved or certified. Worse, Karen had been using the second version as the basis for all her correspondence with residents and the county. According to Mark, this wasn't just a procedural error. It was deception, plain and simple. And if she had been collecting dues or issuing fines based on that unauthorized map, it bordered on civil fraud. We had our smoking gun. With that discovery, Mark expanded the scope of our civil complaint and began preparing a formal request for an audit of the HOA's operations. He brought in a financial investigator who specialized in nonprofit governance and handed over years of public records, newsletters, fee schedules, and Karen's infamous visual conformity notices. The investigator found discrepancies almost immediately: funds collected from addresses not legally in the HOA, late fees charged with no due process, and vague budget reports that listed expenses like community cohesion initiatives and presidential stipends. It was a mess, and all of it pointed back to Karen. Mark explained that if the audit showed misuse of funds, we could trigger a hearing with the county's Civil Oversight Board, which had the power to dissolve HOAs under specific conditions. We were no longer just defending my rights. We were aiming to bring down the whole rotten structure. But Karen, either sensing the tide turning or just doubling down on her madness, wasn't finished. The very next afternoon, while I was on a call with Mark, a drone buzzed over my backyard and hovered directly above my deck. It wasn't just passing by. It hovered, tilted, adjusted, and aimed a little camera straight at my face. I waved at it with a sarcastic smile, then pulled out my phone and recorded it. The drone flew off a minute later, but when I checked the footage, the drone had a registration tag on the underside. It took less than an hour to trace it, registered to one Stuart Fisher, the same man who had come to my porch wearing a necktie in the woods, claiming to be the HOA's compliance coordinator. We added that to the case, too: unauthorized surveillance, invasion of privacy, stalking. It was almost impressive how determined they were to drown themselves. The night before we filed, I sat at the edge of my dock, legs dangling over the dark water, watching the lights flicker across the cove. Somewhere up there, Karen was probably scribbling in her logbook or pacing her deck, rehearsing legal threats. But for the first time since I moved in, I didn't feel cornered. I felt powerful. I had evidence, allies, and the law on my side. What she didn't know was that Mark had scheduled the filing for first thing Monday morning and had already notified the press. The courthouse smelled like decades of stale wood polish and frustrated arguments, the kind of place where time moved slowly, but consequences didn't. I arrived with Mark and his assistant just before 9 a.m., dressed in a plain button-up and boots that still had a smudge of dock mud on the heel. Karen was already there, seated at the far end of the hall, her lips pursed in tight calculation as she whispered with her lawyer, a smug man in an overpriced suit who looked like he hadn't actually practiced litigation in years. She glanced at me with a sneer that held no real venom, just that desperate arrogance of someone who's so used to winning by intimidation that they haven't noticed their bluff being called. The room filled quickly with a quiet hum of tension as HOA board members filtered in behind her, trying to look dignified while sweating through their matching green polos. The judge entered with a rustle of robes and a tired expression. And once we were all seated, the real show began. Mark rose first, calm and precise, laying out a timeline that started with my property purchase and ended with drone surveillance, trespassing, and a multi-count civil harassment complaint. He submitted our trail cam footage, county zoning maps, printed email exchanges, police reports, and the glorious freeze-frame image of Karen crawling under my dock gate with a measuring tape in her teeth. The courtroom was dead silent as the judge leaned forward and muttered, almost to himself, "Is that a flashlight in her mouth?" Mark confirmed it was. I caught the faintest twitch of a smile on the judge's face, and I knew right then we had momentum. Karen's lawyer tried to regain footing by launching into a disjointed argument about the importance of community standards and the need for visual consistency along shared lakefront environments. It was more speech than legal defense, filled with vague buzzwords and references to bylaws that weren't even valid on my property. When the judge asked him directly to show proof that my cabin fell under the HOA's jurisdiction, the man cleared his throat, fumbled through his binder, and ultimately handed over one of Karen's fake boundary maps, the very one the county had rejected 3 times. Mark pounced on it. He submitted the certified map from the clerk's office with the stamped note explicitly confirming that my parcel had never been under HOA control. Then came the best part. Mark flipped to our next piece of evidence, the audit summary. It listed over a dozen properties outside HOA lines that had been falsely assessed dues, received violation notices, or had threats of liens placed on them for non-compliance. The judge frowned, adjusted his glasses, and asked Karen's attorney if he had a rebuttal. The man looked like someone had swapped his speech notes with a takeout menu. He stammered something about clerical oversight and mapping confusion, but the damage was done. Then Mark called our surprise witness, Cynthia from the county clerk's office. She stepped up with a calm authority, her voice slicing through the courtroom with practiced clarity. She testified that Karen had submitted altered maps on multiple occasions and had been denied each time. She also confirmed that official zoning records clearly excluded my property and the others in question. Karen, seated stiffly at her table, kept tapping her pen against her clipboard, her knuckles whitening with each tick of sound. But it got worse. Mark queued up the trail cam video again, only this time he let it run longer, catching audio of Karen muttering to herself about finally nailing this guy and making sure his dock isn't too wide. The judge looked up sharply. "Are we to understand," he asked, "that she entered the property without permission on more than one occasion for the purpose of enforcement based on a map she knew was unofficial?" Mark confirmed it with a nod and submitted a sworn affidavit I had signed detailing each incident. The judge turned toward Karen and asked, "Do you have a response to these allegations?" She stood, trembling slightly, and said, "I was just trying to protect the character of the lakefront. That's what the association was built for. People like him don't care about harmony. They ruin it with loud music and garish paint colors." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, I have seen no evidence of noise complaints, and your own map shows the property lies outside of your governance. Why exactly did you repeatedly enter his property?" Karen hesitated, then said something that would haunt her for the rest of the hearing. She blurted, "Because I knew if I didn't catch him doing something, someone else would move in and make it worse." There was a long silence. Mark simply said, "Let the record show that the defendant admitted her actions were preemptive and not based on any actual violation." The judge scribbled a note on his pad, nodded slowly, and moved on. Things unraveled from there. Stewart, the necktie-wearing drone pilot, was called as a board representative. He tried to appear professional but quickly stumbled when asked about the surveillance drone. It was a compliance check, he insisted. "We've done them before." Mark asked, "On properties not in the HOA?" Stewart hesitated, then shrugged. "Sometimes we need to see how neighboring parcels affect community integrity." The judge leaned forward and asked, "Are you suggesting the HOA monitors properties not within its legal boundaries without consent by air?" Stewart flinched and muttered, "Not usually." Mark responded with one more bombshell, an invoice from a third-party drone company addressed to the HOA for lake perimeter flyovers, billed 3 weeks after I moved in. It was all coming together, a web of overreach and entitlement finally collapsing under the weight of its own audacity. After a short recess, the judge returned and made it clear he was taking the matter seriously. He issued a temporary restraining order against Karen, barring her from entering my property, contacting me directly or indirectly, or authorizing any surveillance. He also ordered a full audit of the HOA's past 5 years of operations, with a special review of boundary enforcement and dues collection. The hearing was not over. Civil proceedings would continue, but the tone had been set. Karen was no longer an enforcer. She was a defendant. Her board was no longer a council of power, but a panel of suspects. And I, once just the quiet guy with the muddy boots and the lakeside dream, had become something else entirely. A symbol, maybe, or just the first person to finally say enough and mean it. As we left the courtroom, Mark slapped the case folder closed and smiled. "She didn't just shoot herself in the foot," he said. "She reloaded halfway through." I chuckled, exhausted but vindicated. Outside, a few other residents who had shown up for the hearing came up to shake my hand. One woman whispered that she had wanted to challenge the HOA for years but didn't know how. Another man said he'd been fined twice for not trimming his bushes to regulation height and was glad someone finally stood up. It was surreal, like I'd unintentionally become the face of quiet resistance. As I drove back to the cabin, the lake shimmered beneath the late afternoon sun, and I felt something I hadn't felt since I bought the place: peace. Not just the absence of noise, but the kind that came with knowing the tide had turned, and the bully with the clipboard was no longer in charge. 3 days after the restraining order was issued, I woke up to find a glossy flyer shoved through the slats of my gate with the kind of zeal normally reserved for political pamphlets or doomsday warnings. It was printed in full color, splashed with dramatic headlines like "Preserve Our Lakefront's Purity" and "Stop the Decline Before It's Too Late," and featured an unflattering, zoomed-in photo of my dock taken from across the water. Karen, undeterred by legal boundaries or basic decency, had apparently found a way to continue her campaign from the shadows. The flyer referred to me only as the instigator, warned of dangerous legal precedents, and accused me of trying to dismantle cherished traditions and destroy community safeguards. I didn't even get mad. I just snapped a photo of the flyer and sent it to Mark with a one-word text: persistence. He responded less than a minute later with 3 words: public relations nightmare. Then he followed up with something better: also, she's about to lose the lakefront. While the courtroom drama had made a satisfying splash, what came next hit like a tidal wave. The audit ordered by the judge had officially begun, and the forensic accountant hired to comb through the HOA's financials was thorough to the point of surgical. He cross-checked dues, fines, and expenditures with parcel records, confirmed addresses, examined banking transfers, and reviewed every HOA-related payment going back 7 years. And when the dust settled, the report he handed us was a masterpiece of disaster. Not only had Karen authorized fees from non-HOA members, including me and at least 6 others, but she had also greenlit payments from HOA funds to cover personal travel, printing costs for those ridiculous flyers, a catered compliance summit hosted at her house, and unbelievably an expensive lakefront bench engraved with the phrase "in honor of order." The bench alone had cost over $1,200 and had been installed on a disputed easement, a strip of land that, legally, as of a quiet county auction held 2 months earlier due to unpaid taxes, now belonged to me. That twist came courtesy of Mark, who had gone digging through county sale records just for fun and discovered that the HOA, in its disorganized grandeur, had missed a property tax payment on a small sliver of lakefront easement. The county, operating as it always did, slow but relentless, had auctioned it off in a quiet online sale with no fanfare. Mark, curious and cautious, had bid on it. He won for less than $2,000. Neither Karen nor her board had noticed until Mark filed the deed transfer last week, right after our last court appearance. That bench with her name on it? It was sitting squarely on land I now owned. The day we revealed that was one I would never forget. Mark scheduled a press conference, nothing fancy, just a county-allowed outdoor update where he read aloud selected passages from the audit and then, with a smile that could slice steel, unveiled the newly issued deed, stamped and signed, showing that the HOA's beloved public bench now rested on my private land. A reporter from the local paper asked what I planned to do with the bench. I told him I was thinking of keeping it right where it was, as a reminder. A reminder of what? The reporter asked. I said that sometimes when people try too hard to control others, they end up handing over the very thing they wanted to protect. The article ran 2 days later under the headline, "HOA President's Throne Now Belongs to the Enemy." Karen didn't show her face for a week after that. But the real hammer came down during the next hearing, when the judge, armed with the full audit and updated case files, laid into the HOA like a teacher discovering that the straight-A student had been cheating on every test. He cited the misuse of funds, the unauthorized boundary expansion attempts, the falsified documentation, and the pattern of harassment that now spanned multiple years and multiple victims. Several other residents had come forward with their own stories: quiet families who'd paid fines they didn't know just to avoid confrontation, older couples who had been told their wind chimes violated decibel policies, a man who had been threatened with foreclosure over a garden gnome. The courtroom became a gallery of grievances, each one more absurd and damning than the last. Karen's lawyer tried to object, claiming the testimonies were irrelevant to my case. The judge shut him down by stating that this wasn't just about one property anymore. It was about a culture of fear and abuse built around false authority. In a final twist that no one saw coming except maybe Mark, the judge announced his intent to formally recommend that the HOA be placed under county supervision pending review for dissolution. He stated that the structure had become untenable, possibly fraudulent, and that the county had every right to intervene under municipal code regarding abusive private associations. Karen's face, normally arranged in an expression of smug certainty, fell completely blank. She didn't blink. She didn't move. She just sat there, staring straight ahead, like the world was dissolving behind her eyes. And maybe it was. The HOA board members fidgeted uncomfortably, several whispering among themselves. One even stood and announced his resignation right there in court. No one stopped him. No one cared. Back at the lake that evening, I pulled up a lawn chair and watched as a few local newsvans slowly circled the area, unsure where to park or who to interview. I wasn't interested in giving another statement. The facts were loud enough on their own. Across the water, Karen's house was dark again, but this time something about the silence felt permanent. The flags were gone. The drones had disappeared. The phone calls, the flyers, the clipboard patrols, all had vanished into the wind. For the first time, I felt like the land around me exhaled. Like the trees, the lake, and even the porch boards beneath my feet were no longer holding their breath. A few days later, I hosted a gathering at the easement. It wasn't a victory party, at least not officially. It was just a Saturday barbecue. A few neighbors came, including Joe in his ever-present fishing vest, and Cynthia from the clerk's office showed up with homemade pie. Mark came too, shaking hands and smiling awkwardly like a man unaccustomed to being celebrated. We drank beer, shared stories, and for the first time laughed without looking over our shoulders. The infamous bench was still there, but someone had taped a sign to it that read, "Now open to all." No one touched it. No one needed to. Its presence said everything. Later that evening, as the sun melted into the lake and music played softly from someone's phone, I stood at the end of the dock with a plate of ribs in one hand and a beer in the other, thinking about how close I had come to folding when it all began. It would have been easy to back down, to ignore the flyers, to let the trespasses go, to repaint the cabin and join the meetings just to keep peace. But if I had done that, I would have lost more than just freedom. I would have lost the belief that some fights, however absurd, are worth standing for. Karen had built her empire on silence, intimidation, and fear. All I did was shine a light on it. And now, with the lake calm, the dock repaired, and neighbors finally smiling, I realized that sometimes the only way to end a rain is to simply refuse to kneel. It was strange how quickly everything shifted once the grip of fear was broken. The lakefront, once patrolled and scrutinized like a cold suburban dictatorship, now breathed with a kind of lightness I had never seen in it before. The days after the judge's announcement felt like waking up in a new town, one where neighbors waved instead of watching from behind curtains, where porch lights flicked on in welcome rather than warning. There was no more second-guessing whether building a birdhouse or parking a canoe too close to the dock would trigger a visit from clipboard-wielding enforcers. The HOA board had scattered. The meetings were suspended indefinitely, and the county had begun formal proceedings to dissolve the organization entirely, a process that required months of hearings and documentation, but whose outcome was no longer in doubt. Karen had been stripped of her presidency, her access to funds, and her ceremonial authority. She had become a ghost in her own empire, her presence marked only by the occasional closed curtain and a car that never seemed to leave the driveway. She didn't show her face, not at the grocery store, not at the post office, not on her front lawn. The community had finally seen what she was beneath the practiced tone and self-appointed mandates, and they had turned away from her with the quiet severity of people who'd had enough. The lakefront easement that I had acquired, purely by accident but now deeply symbolic, became more than just a narrow patch of land. It turned into a gathering place, a kind of unofficial town square where people brought folding chairs and snacks and laughter. A place where kids chased dragonflies and old men fished without measuring their line against an imaginary regulation. It wasn't organized. It didn't need to be. For once, the absence of control felt like liberation. And as the weeks passed and the county sent out formal notices dissolving the HOA charter and reassessing local administrative control, something even more unexpected happened. The neighbors who had once tiptoed or remained silent began to tell their stories. One by one, they came to me, not out of hero worship, but relief. A woman named Linda, who had been fined for having wind chimes that made noise after dusk, told me how Karen once stood on her porch with a stopwatch, timing the intervals between chimes. An elderly couple revealed that they had been too afraid to put up a garden trellis because Karen had once claimed it would interfere with visual uniformity. Another man admitted that he had removed a hummingbird feeder after receiving a letter accusing him of unapproved wildlife baiting. These were real people, good people who had spent years dimming their lives to avoid conflict. And now that the spell was broken, they were reclaiming their space inch by inch. One afternoon, I found a handwritten card tucked into my screen door. It was from a boy named Eli who lived 3 cabins down. He had drawn a picture of a dock and a smiling stick figure standing next to a big dog. Underneath it, he'd written, "Thank you for making the lake nice again." It was the kind of thing that stopped me in my tracks. Not because of the drawing or the praise, but because I realized just how deep Karen's reach had gone, how much of the joy in this place had been quietly stolen while no one was looking. I pinned the card to the inside of my kitchen cabinet, right next to the trail cam printouts I no longer needed, a little reminder of why I had fought so hard for something that on paper seemed so small. The county eventually held a final public meeting to conclude the oversight hearings. And while I didn't plan to speak, they asked me to say a few words. I kept it short. I told them I hadn't come to the lakefront to start a revolution. I came to heal, to rebuild, to live quietly. But I couldn't do that while someone treated the neighborhood like a monarchy and my property like a target. I said that community isn't about rules and fences and uniformity. It's about respect, and the moment you take that away, you lose everything that makes a place worth living in. There wasn't applause, just nods. That was enough. The real closure came on a golden September afternoon when I hosted what the neighbors started calling the Dock Day Bash. It started small, just a cookout with some burgers and corn and an old radio playing blues classics. But by the time the sun began to dip behind the trees, nearly 24 people had shown up. Someone brought folding tables. Another person brought a canoe race banner. There were coolers full of soda and beer, dogs chasing each other between lawn chairs, and a kid selling lemonade for quarters no one asked back. Mark came too, this time as a guest, not a lawyer. He stood on the edge of the dock with a drink in his hand, taking it all in like he had just crossed the finish line of a marathon no one knew he was running. Even Cynthia from the clerk's office showed up, laughing harder than I'd ever seen her. And somewhere between the grilled peaches and the impromptu acoustic guitar sing-along, someone walked over and said, "You should put up a sign." I asked, "A sign for what?" They said, "Something simple, just so people know this space is open, that it belongs to the lake now." I thought about it for a while, and the next morning I carved a piece of driftwood with a pocket knife and hung it from the old bench Karen once claimed for herself. It didn't say much. Just 3 words, all are welcome. No rules, no codes, no inspections, just peace. About a week later, I saw Karen for the first time in months. She was walking slowly, not with the stiff posture she used to adopt when she patrolled the roads, but hunched slightly, like someone carrying the invisible weight of too much silence. She passed by on the far side of the road and glanced once in my direction. I raised my hand in a neutral gesture, not a wave, not a challenge, just a human acknowledgement. She didn't return it, just kept walking, clipboardless, unnoticed, unneeded. And that, more than anything, told me the story was over. She wasn't a villain anymore, just a person whose time had passed. As the leaves began to turn and the evenings cooled, I found myself sitting by the water most nights, not to guard the property or watch for trespassers, but just to be still. The lake had become everything I wanted it to be: quiet, kind, whole. The battle had been loud and absurd and exhausting, but it ended in something rare and real, a place where people smiled without flinching, where laughter rang out louder than paranoia, where the wind carried no warnings, only the soft rustle of trees at peace. This was more than winning. This was living. And I planned to do it for a long, long time.